Howdy, and welcome to the Aggie Teach Momentum podcast, brought to you by the Aggie Teach Arts and Sciences program at Texas A&M University. I am your host, Kenrick Davies, former high school physics and astronomy teacher and current program manager for Aggie Teach Arts and Sciences. This podcast is meant to provide a little more insight and information to those seeking a secondary content teacher certification in Texas. We aim to provide episodes that help pre-service educators on the path to certification, as well as leverage the experience of myself and other guest speakers to support teachers in their first few years in the classroom. Today's topic should be a good one. It's going to be on classroom efficiency. It's a topic that our students ask about a lot, about how do we handle our classroom in such a way that we get all the things done. And in the studio today, we have my program coordinator in the Aggie Teach office here at the College of Arts and Sciences, and that's Colby Richardson. He was a former social studies teacher in Bryan ISD. Welcome, Colby.
Howdy, it's an honor to be here today.
Awesome. So a couple of former educators sitting here talking about what were the things that made our classroom run effectively. And I know that there's probably one simple thing that we can point to right here at the beginning that can maximize classroom efficiency. What can a teacher do in their classroom that can really just make all the difference?
One thing that always helps me out the most is just being prepared and planning well, and one of those is classroom layout.
Yeah, so I completely agree with you. I think we're both on the same page with that the classroom layout can make or break your day, right? I mean, and what we're talking about is the desks in the right spots, the materials being in the right spot, right, for what you're doing that day. You see pictures of the rank and file classrooms, right, the desks that are in rows, no one sitting next to each other, and you know who that benefits? That benefits the custodian.
Yes.
That does not benefit the teacher at all, right? It doesn't go well with the activity for the day, most likely. Maybe if it's a test, sure. I don't know. What are some of those things that a classroom layout can really help in the long run?
So one of the things that you really need to be thinking about when it comes to the classroom setup is your students with disabilities, first of all. These students, have their own sort of needs, right? So if you have someone who can't see well, maybe it's a good opportunity for you to open up the classroom a little bit. Definitely have that spot picked out where they need to be sitting, wherever that might be, whatever's beneficial to them. But normally this is going to be listed in their paperwork as well. So you don't have to fly blind on any of those changes. So.
That's true. It's most of the time in paperwork for a Section 504 student or for a special education student, it may say something like preferential seating, and you may have to conference with the student or with their special education teacher to know what that means, right? Does it mean that they need to be near you for attention reasons? Does it need to be that they need to be near the door for accessibility reasons, right? So that's something that you kind of have to clear with them. But really, I mean, the way that you set up your classroom is going to influence how well you're able to go through that activity, right? To give an example, if you're planning on doing group work, then you got to put your desks in groups, right? Otherwise, you're going to spend time getting your students to put them in groups. That's just wasted time in the classroom. For me, as a science teacher, when we needed to go into the lab, right? And I taught in both sort of classroom layouts where I had a separate lab and lecture area, but I also taught in a classroom where I just had, the room and we had to make do with what we had. It was about material placement, right?
Correct.
If I was going to be using certain materials, one, I needed to pull those kind of into their locations to begin with, right? I had to prepare for the day by pulling out all the materials that I needed, but put them in strategic places around the room so that when students had to go get them, it wasn't going to create a bottleneck or a congestion area, which was just going to waste time, right?
Right. And I've seen the exact same thing in the history classrooms that I dealt with, having students making maps and doing timelines, and they need map colors or markers or whatever it is. You have to have these placed strategically, normally all around the classroom, because if not, then yes, you're going to waste a lot of time having students individually go and get all of these materials.
Yeah, and we'll talk about like procedures and routines a little bit later, but if a student knows where they're supposed to turn in work, if you have a designated area for that, or what they're supposed to do on the way into the classroom, right? I mean, all of these things, if there's a designated space for it and the students know when and how to use that, then it's just going to decrease the amount of time that you spend in the long run having to get the students doing something like that. And I guess the last part of this sort of discussion is about making your class change with the needs of the day, right? If you have group work, then make groups. if you have a test, then put them in the layout that's going to be conducive for a test, right? I know you did a lot of discussions. So like what sort of desk layout did you have for your discussions?
A lot of times, the discussion questions that I like to field, I had them just set up in a circle sometimes, or maybe like if it was more conducive to have them in a giant rectangle or something like that, where I was in the middle or whoever was speaking was in the middle. They could get up or not. Normally, getting up wasn't a requirement. So just having them all being facing each other and sort of having an equal place in the discussion was best for those types of situations.
So I think this is going to come up a lot of times during our discussion, but it's going to be about pre-planning, right? I mean, if you plan for the day and make steps either at the end of the previous day or the beginning before your students get there in the morning of setting up your room according to your needs for that particular day, then that's going to obviously alleviate a lot of issues. So I know many of our students and early career alumni worry about getting everything done in the time that they have. So let's talk about ways that a new teacher can increase their time management in the classroom. And time management is kind of a really big topic here. So what we're talking about are the little things that a teacher can do, or big things that a teacher can do, that is going to help them get through the material that they need to for that particular day or the week or the unit. So, I mean, what's a tip that you have for our teachers?
So something that I found hard to deal with when I was a brand new teacher was just the pacing that I would take for time management. The two big ones, of course, too quick, too slow. For me, I found myself being too slow, which is good because actually for me, being too slow means I'm comfortable with the classroom. So that was a positive that I was comfortable, but the problem was I was just too slow. And so then I needed to reroute that and think about how I might be quicker in the classroom.
I had the exact opposite problem. I spoke way too fast. And maybe our listeners already know this because I speak fast on this podcast sometimes. But when I get excited, when I get, doing something that I really love to do, then I'm going to talk very quickly. And so for me, I was getting through my material way too quickly and would have downtime at the end. So, I mean, if you're one of those people that is going to get through the material too quickly and have, 5-10 minutes at the end of class and not know what to do, you got to be prepared for that, right? You got to have an activity that's waiting for it. You got to have a discussion question. You got to have something that's going to fill that time, because we know that wasted time is going to be where disruption problems happen. It's going to be where you have students goofing off, or, just things that shouldn't be happening in your classroom start to happen if you don't have a structured time period for it.
Right, yeah. Definitely want to cut down on those discipline problems.
So for me, I had to overplan, and I know you did too. We've talked about this. You overplan. And so overplanning is kind of a double-edged sword a little bit, right? Because if you overplan with the expectation of getting through everything and you don't, then all that's going to do is kind of create some stress on the teacher, right? I mean, you're thinking at the end of the day, I didn't do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it really, if you're over planning and you're not getting through your material, that means your students are not getting all the material that they need, which means you either have to waste more time going back the next day, or they may just not get that material if it's down to the wire. So.
And over planning with me, if I'm rushing through because I'm hyped up on the adrenaline at the front of the classroom and I'm rushing the instruction, then that means I may get through everything, but did my students actually learn everything? Did we have a sufficient amount of time to discuss and wrestle with the concepts, practice the skills? All of that stuff kind of comes into play. We always talk about this, routines and procedures, right? The simple things of, what do I do in the first 5 minutes of class? How do I turn in work? Where do I go when I'm transitioning from lecture to lab, or from this activity to this activity? If the students know what they're supposed to do, then those times can go by very, very quickly, and students can move from one thing to another without being prompted or without wasting a lot of time. So that'll certainly help. So it goes back to the purposeful planning, right? It goes back for planning for those events, planning for those situations. You know that you're going to be transitioning from one thing to another. You know that students are going to walk into your classroom and they either need to immediately get started on something because they are going to cause disruptions if they don't, or maybe it's a lazy day and they don't necessarily need to get started on something, but you need to be ready for them to do something at the beginning of class, right? I mean, you have to produce these routines and procedures and practice them really early on so that students kind of know what they need to be doing. We know that students don't do well if they're subjected to that sit and get. You can't see me, I'm doing air quotes here in the studio, sit and get. That's what we call, that 90 minutes of a student just sitting in the chair listening to the teacher, 90 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever your class period is. Sit and get. That method of teaching every day is honestly incredibly monotonous, and it's monotonous for the teacher as well as the student. I know I was not going to be a teacher that was going to be sitting there and speaking to my students for 90 minutes. Did I do it? Yes. Sometimes you have to, sometimes you don't have to, and you just do it anyway because that's just how it needs to run. But there's ways that we go about trying to increase engagement in the classroom. And we do that sometimes through projects, through group work. For me as a science teacher, I did it through lab investigations. Of course, that's an important skill for them to learn as well. But these are a whole different beast when it comes to time management. It's effectively managing the activity, not only for learning, but also to make sure that it happens within the time frame that we're giving it, right?
Right, correct. And as it goes back to being efficient, right, and time management, it's not required per se to be an efficient classroom to have these activities, but classroom efficiency and classroom management go hand in hand in this case, in that having the students be engaged means that your classroom will run superbly more efficient.
So having clear expectations and procedures, right? I mean, that kind of goes back to that. Routines, procedures, we're going to probably say that 15 more times in this episode, but if the students know what they're supposed to be doing, then they'll be able to do it a lot easier and in a lot shorter amount of time than if they are unclear on expectations or unclear on directions. If there's wasted time, students will find whatever they can to fill that time. One of the group projects that we would do a lot in science classes, we called it PBLs, project-based learning, problem-based learning. And I know it's not just for science, but this is a overall problem where a group of students are all trying to solve that problem in a particular way. And it could be a manufacturer problem. It could be that you're searching for the next car design that's going to fare well in a crash, right? We did that a lot in physics, nice. crashing different design cars. So it's a manufacturer problem, obviously. Right. But it's meant to teach skills, right? Investigation, testing. It's meant to teach the physics or the science involved, right? And one of the ways that we would go about doing this type of activity is through group roles, right? You had a role of a scribe. That person was meant on taking notes on everything, right? You had maybe the researcher. That person was designated the person to go out and find information. I can tell you the first time I did one of these types of activities, I had a role of the scientist, right? They were the ones that were supposed to go learn the science, maybe from me in small group setting, and then they were supposed to go back and teach the rest of their group. You're laughing because you kind of know exactly where this is going to go, right? Having a student go back to teach the other students the science, that didn't really work out very, very well, right? I mean, you're the teacher in the classroom. You're the one that's really got to be worried about whether or not a student is getting the content. So roles can certainly work very well if you structure them properly, but I can tell you that was not the best way of doing that. So what about other group work type situations? What are some other tips that you have for group work?
So, project-based learning was a term that they used and threw around as well on my side in the history department. A lot of times it just meant using a certain type of jigsaw in which you are having each student do a particular section of the unit, or you're going over a reviewing section. But we did other things as well. So I also was advised a lot of times to make sure that each unit that you have a review section, even if it's not over the full unit, it's over a portion of maybe one or two lessons that you covered, to just have the students get up, move around, and do something completely different. Because unfortunately, the sit and get method, is very typical for the history high school classroom. There's just a lot of information you have to cover. It's all being tested, especially with U.S. history, which is the subject I was teaching most often. But anytime that we could get them up and moving around or doing something different, it's definitely helpful to just have the students do that, because it just helps them out all the other times that you have to deal with them.
Yeah, I think with the group projects, or when getting them up and moving around, or doing anything involving hands-on learning, in the classroom, there has to be clear expectations both on behavior but also on timing. Right? I remember a lot of times where we would do things out in the hallway or even around the campus, depending on what the activity was. But there was a clear expectation that you have to be done by X time and be back in your seat. Right? If you trusted your students enough to be able to go out of your sight, right? And you had to be back by X time. But there's a clear expectation here. If it's a group project that's going to take multiple days or even over the course of a unit, right, depending on the scope of the project, then you again have to pre-plan, right? You have to be saying, oh, well, your group needs to be done with X, Y, and Z part of the project by this date. On this date, I'm going to be checking for this portion to be completed, right? And that has to be an expectation that's done at the beginning. If you try to put that expectation in halfway through the project, there's going to be, some issues with that. Your students are going to kind of buck against that. Again, coming back to that purposeful planning, right? Planning for when you want to get this done, and also backtrack that out and say, okay, scaffold it up. I need to have part 1 done by this day, part 2 by this day, because I need the end result to be done on this day, right? I mean, that's kind of the background for time management on a project is you need to have it done by a certain day. All right, scaffold it from there to make sure that it gets done by that day.
Yeah, very, very clear instructions. Put it all out there ahead of time, and they're like, oh yeah, you can do this whole project, it's due in a month, and you leave it at that. I promise you it's going to be a nightmare.
All right, so switching gears a bit, let's talk about what happens when we assess students and find out that they aren't as proficient in the material as we wanted them to be. How do we balance the pressure to move on and keep our pacing schedule with the needs of our students to go back and reteach? So this is a question we get a lot, and it's, what happens if our students didn't get it, right? What happens if our students didn't get it? What do we do then? And if you're not familiar with what a pacing schedule is, this is typically a document that the district puts out that says you have 7 days to complete Unit 4, right? And by March 20th, then you should be done with Unit 7, right? This is a pacing schedule for the entire year that says here is the amount of material you need to get covered and by when you need to cover it. And of course, as teachers, it's really hard to say in September that you're going to be on pace in February, right? It's really hard to say that. So that's our pacing schedule. And we understand the need for it, right? Pacing schedule is all about making sure that we get through all the material by the end of the year or by the test or whatever it is that we're working towards. But we also need to be attuned to our students and their needs, right?
Right.
So for me, one of the things that I would always do to help keep tabs on the topics or the skills that I need students to really know was to use Bellwork, right? And I'm sure Bellwork is one of those things that our listeners probably have seen, know, experienced, whatever. It's just taking 5 minutes at the beginning of class to work through a problem, to answer a question. The problem with Bellwork from a time management standpoint is that if you're not on them about getting it done in 5 minutes, then you can easily spend 15 or 20 minutes, working on the Bellwork question that was supposed to be just a short little review. I don't know. Did you ever have anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. And, the big problem with Bellwork is that you're right. You have to be on top of it. You have to get those students actively engaged right on time. Because even if it's not that so much that it's your responsibility in getting it, it's just sometimes the students, they take like 5 minutes to warm up at the beginning of the lesson. And if you only have a 45-minute or 50-minute period, then you've just lost, a fifth of your time, essentially.
Yeah, what we're really talking about here is this term called content spiraling, right? Content spiraling is sort of a way to go back and reteach or touch on previous topics while also moving forward with the new topics. And of course, this is going to look very different and very in different content areas. For, say, science, right? Science operates under these big ideas, like matter and energy or scale and proportion and things like that. And we could be talking about those big ideas in, say, I'm going to give a physics example here because I was a physics teacher, projectile motion, right? We could talk about motion and energy and projectile motion, but we could talk about the same motion and energy if we're talking about, say, electrostatics or electrodynamics. And in reality, mathematically and conceptually, there's a lot of overlap in some of the topics that we end up talking about. So there's natural content spiraling. We can review projectile motion when we're doing the motion of charged particles through an electric field. It's the same sort of deal. And I know you've had a kind of a different take from your history background on what content spiraling looks like.
Yeah, content spiraling is a fairly new sort of word that has really come into my understanding. Maybe I've used it all along, or we really use it in history, but how it works in a history classroom is normally you follow a set timeline. Like, you don't want to kind of get away from the timeline. It really grounds students in what's going on during that time period in history. I'm going to be focusing on U.S. history since that's the one I taught the most. So normally you would cover the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and a Vietnam unit sort of tacked onto that, since Vietnam sort of took place during all of those time periods. But at the very end of all of those units, you'd normally go back and you'd cover a civil rights unit. But really, the civil rights movement is being covered during all three of those decades. And so you're kind of relating all of that information with the civil rights and how it played out, and reminding students about some of the topics that you've already talked about. You're really kind of grounding them in that long-term reevaluation of some of the stuff that you've already covered.
So we're really talking about accentuating the complexity of the topic, right? I mean, maybe students are only really ready to talk about one facet of it, but when you talk about the second and third and fourth topic, now we can start making those connections back to that original idea or just everything else that was going on at the time. So that's a really cool way of being able to go back and talk about the things that they've already learned and make it more relevant to the stuff that you're learning now. So it's a really cool way of content spiraling. So really, there's kind of multiple ways to do content spiraling. Is it just, I'm going to take some time at the beginning of every one of my class periods to ask them about a question that they've already learned? Yeah, okay, that's one way to do it. We could do it naturally by making those connections from previous learning to current learning, right? We can say, this topic that we're learning today, that's really just like the thing that we talked about last week. It's just kind of in a different view, right? Or you have the kind of the natural spiraling that happens through just interrelated events and interrelated topics that we talk about in class. Now, of course, this can be a place where we waste a lot of time, right? We waste a lot of time going back and reteaching the subject matter when our students don't get it. So one of the best ways to try to minimize the amount of time that we spend having to go back and reteach is just to stay on the learning on the front end, right? If we do the formative assessments along the way, the initial time that we go through it, then we're going to have a real clear understanding whether or not our students are going to get it on that final exam, right, or the summative assessment. And there's a real big difference between only 2 students not getting it and 20 students not getting it.
Another content spiraling can easily be going back and trying to reinforce something that you feel like a majority of your class hasn't gotten. What you did bring up there, and I like to point this out, is that you do need to do enough research to make sure some, formative assessments of your students to make sure that enough students haven't gotten the material that you need to do content spiraling. Because if you just go back and content spiral, there could be boredom in there. And then, of course, that causes some problems with students and the efficiency of your classroom. So.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you're making a choice off of information that is not accurate about your students, right? Everyone did not get Newton's second law, right? Everyone didn't get Newton's second law, so we got to go back and reteach that. In reality, only one person didn't get Newton's second law, and then you just have wasted an entire class period going back and reteaching a subject or a topic that you didn't have to have it. Another kind of view on this that I'm going to throw out is that a lot of times, though, you're not the only teacher in the school that teaches the same subject, and different teachers teach differently, right? So you may be in a situation where your class has got it. You have been able to meet the pacing schedule, but one of your other team members maybe hasn't, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you haven't because you're a new teacher and you're still trying to figure out how to do all this. So then what happens then, right? Do you hang back with your partner, or do you just keep trudging ahead? At some point, you can't take the test on a different day, right? Typically, the district doesn't like that, but these are all parts of the complex issue. So there are those that turn toward classroom technology as a way to increase efficiency in the classroom. And everything from administrative tasks to student assessment has a tech tool that can be used to better use class time, or at least that's how it's advertised, right? And I know AI is a big one. We probably won't hit on AI too much. I know we have a previous podcast episode where we talk a lot about this idea of classroom technology. But really, what we kind of want to talk about is how the classroom technology can really improve efficiency. And there's two ways to go about talking about it. We can talk about the tools that the teacher can use to improve classroom efficiency, and then we have the tools that students will use to improve learning or the efficiency at which learning happens. What were some of the tools that you used to help with just the teacher efficiency?
So the teacher efficiency it's nothing groundbreaking, but it's just some ideas or things that you could use to just speed up your classroom. Early on, I was given an iPad for my district, and I wasn't a big fan of it until I figured out that I could actually use it to take attendance while roaming around the room while I'm doing that bell work, right?
Yep.
So I'm no longer stuck at my desk, behind my desk, taking a quick attendance. I can actually roam around, help people with questions, keep my eyes on students. That's another big thing about efficiency is being able to see everybody in your classroom at any given time, right? But this technology helped me roam around the classroom, so I was mobile. I wasn't stuck behind my desk.
Yeah, I had something similar. I didn't use it for roll, but I had a tablet that I could draw on, and it would project to my screen. And I had a couple of different methods of doing this, depending on the level of technology at the time. But that really helped with discussions, right? If we wanted to talk about a particular topic, or we were taking notes and there was a discussion happening in the classroom, I could use that to help facilitate the discussion. I could hand it over to a student and say, here, draw what you're thinking. And it was, a part of the discussion. So it was accentuating learning, but it was a teacher tool. It was something that I was using to help with that. The other side of this would be the tools that students use, and there's a lot that bridge the gap, right? I mean, there's a lot that we could say Kahoot, right? Kahoot or Quizlet or any of those. Those are things that teachers use to help with, say, reviewing concepts, but students like them. They're higher engagement, pros and cons to all that kind of stuff. We also can talk about technology kind of in different veins. You have the technology that can really be applicable to any subject matter, like a Kahoot or something like that, versus the technology that's going to be very specific to a discipline like science, right? I had data collection tools, I had LabQuest, I had motion detectors, I had all of these higher level technology things that were all about just data collection that increased engagement because it was a hands-on learning sort of situation. Bottom line is, though, is that this technology that we use in the classroom, it has to be enhancing the learning, right? If we're using technology and it's just for the sake of using technology, then it's a distraction and it's wasting time in the classroom.
Something else that is again not groundbreaking, but for students to be able to succeed in the classroom is, especially when I was using certain kind of technologies for primary sources, the greatest thing that I found was that it allowed students who maybe didn't speak well English to be able to translate that primary source into their own language. Not only did I have to translate it into Spanish or whatever major prevalent language is located in your school, but also they could get it themselves. I didn't have to have any other resources on hand.
Yeah, that accessibility part is really important, right? I mean, we can use technology to help our students with disabilities or with language barriers to access the same material that everyone else in the classroom is getting. With that idea of enhancing learning, right? So an example of something I used in the classroom that was specific to my particular situation, talking about astronomy. Obviously, I couldn't expect my students to go outside and take data about the sun over the course of a 24-hour period, right? I mean, I have them for 90 minutes, right, or 50 minutes. I obviously could not expect them to go outside and take data about the sun over 365 days. I could not expect them to fly to Mexico and take data about the sun down there. What I'm referring to is a simulation software, right? So we had a simulation software that my students took data. Now, one engaging sort of activity that I had for them was they would submit the data that they were collecting. If it say it was over the entire year, every student was responsible for doing 15 days or something like that. So they had data they had to collect on 15 specific days, and they would collect it and they would submit that data using a Google form. And then I would have a Google Sheet up on the screen that would be plotting the data that they had submitted. So they get immediate feedback on whether or not their data fit in with the trend that was coming up, a trend that they had no idea what was going to be coming up. So there was kind of an intrinsic motivation of, well, what is this graph going to look like, and where's my data going to fit in this graph, which was kind of cool. And we did that several times for different things. And I did that sort of thing in physics as well, just to see what the relationship looked like for varying different variables. So that was an instance where the technology that we were using, which was, not the greatest technology out there, Google Forms and simulation software, free simulation software online, was there enhancing the learning. It wasn't there to get in the way. We weren't spending the time to have to learn this new technology and then waste half the class with bugs or technology issues.
Technology is great, especially if you can find a way to make it simple and enhance the classroom.
Yeah, I know a previous guest on our podcast really talked about the things that you really have to consider when bringing technology into your classroom. And again, this really falls back under that whole idea of purposeful planning, right? I mean, we can't just find a random, link on a Google search and say, oh yeah, this looks good. Let's use this next class period. I learned a long time ago as a teacher, you have to try out the activity before you give it to your students, right? If you don't go through the activity yourself and learn all the nuances of the new tech, then it's not going to work for you. So another weird thing that we have to kind of worry about with technology is this world that we live in post-COVID, right? And of course, we could talk about pre-COVID, post-COVID for decades probably, and the changes that that brought upon education. But in my classroom, we massively switched to technology usage when we came back from COVID quarantine. No one wanted to do paper, right? We didn't want to touch anything. We had to sanitize everything. And that stayed. So the more I taught after COVID, the years they kept coming, and it was just everyone brought in their Chromebook, and everyone did everything online, and there was no note taking. There was hardly any hands-on activities anymore. In science, we were able to kind of go back to that a little bit better, but everything was just so technology driven. And it really felt like the students were just getting tired of it. And maybe some of the listeners who are out there right now experience that, just tired of having to do everything on their computer.
Yeah, there's definitely some research out there that definitely talks about how prolonged use of an electronic device or just staring at a screen all day long is definitely bad for your health.
Yeah, and I mean, I can experience that. They sell blue light filters on glasses to help you stare at a screen all day long. So I think if we're really going to take this whole idea of classroom efficiency and boil it down to a couple of words, it's got to be purposeful planning, right? Purposeful planning. You have to sit down and really think about what it is that you're going to do in your classroom. And it may be tomorrow, right? If we're talking about new teachers, it's a lot of survival mode, and it's what am I doing in my classroom tomorrow? And as you get more experience, it's what am I doing in my classroom next week? Or let's sit down and plan as a team and say, what are we doing for this unit next month, right? I mean, you get more experience, you get better at pre-planning these things. But it's also going to be, how do you handle on-the-fly distractions when something doesn't go well in your classroom? There's an announcement, there's a fire drill, there's, something breaks if you're a science teacher, that happens every once in a while. Someone doesn't bring their Chromebook charger, right?
The internet goes down.
The internet goes down. That happens several times, yeah. So classroom efficiency is about purposeful planning, but it's also about weathering those small distractions and not letting it get too out of hand. And how do you learn this? Experience, right?
Right. I mean, and it's all about that purposeful planning and maximizing the time that you have. At best, we have 6 or 7 hours with these students in the classroom. If you have to maximize that time, like that's all the time you get in a week, right? So you have a lot of material. I promise you, it's a little daunting, but Planning.
And they wonder what teachers do over the summer. And that is all the time we have for today. Thank you, Colby, for joining us in the studio for this episode. The Aggie Teach Momentum podcast drops every 2 weeks, so make sure that you are looking for the next episode on Spotify or linked on the Aggie Teach Arts and Sciences website. For more information, you can visit our program website at aggieteachartsci.tamu.edu. That is aggieteach, ARTSCI.tamu.edu. Thanks and gig 'em.